I'm going to share with you 4 critical things that every new jazz educator needs to know. And we're starting right now. If you're a new jazz educator, you've probably got lots of questions about teaching, about what to do to best help your students. You've probably heard a bunch of things. Some of them may not even be true, and some of them might even lead you down a path that ultimately leads you to fail as a teacher, and worst of all, to hurt your students. So because of that, I want to share with you 4 critical techniques that you need as a teacher of jazz or other music. And we're starting right now with number 1. Years ago, I had a lovely student learned how to play trombone, but his teacher played French horn in the lessons, and guess what instrument his trombone sounded like? French horn. Modeling is a critical teaching technique that you should absolutely be using. And that just means demonstrating, whether it's by playing yourself or with a video or a recording. Now, modeling is especially important if you're teaching anything, a skill or a technique or a procedure that involves students playing anything. If you're teaching instrumental lessons, so for example teaching trombone, then you really should be modeling on the exact instrument that you're playing in the lesson. It's really important that you don't just play the finished product as the example, whether that's you doing it yourself or using a recording or something like that. Of course, that's really important too, to give an overall picture of the ultimate goal, but you should demonstrate each individual step along the way as well. Maybe also as a side benefit, if you're not an expert jazz player yourself, if you go through the steps of an exercise along with your students, you'll learn along with them too, and you'll build up your own skill set as a player. So this technique, modeling, as the name suggests, is all about giving students a good model of whatever it is that they're trying to do. It might be the sound of an instrument. What's their instrument supposed to sound like? What's the tone of a trombone supposed to be like? What does jazz saxophone sound like? Or it might be an improvising technique. It might be some concept, could be all sorts of things. But if they don't know what it's supposed to sound like in the end, and if they can't hear what each step along the way is supposed to sound like, then how are they supposed to do it themselves? It seems unreasonable for us to ask students to do something that they've never heard. If you don't play the same instrument as your students, that's not necessarily a problem. An example of that might be if you're a band teacher and you've got students who play all the different band instruments, it's unlikely that you're a great player of all of those instruments. It's fine, just so long as you aren't modeling tone or technique that's specific to that instrument. But when you're teaching, say, an improvisational technique, you're really teaching the steps along the way to developing fluency in that technique. So in that case, modeling on any instrument is fine, because you're dealing with concepts. Now, if you're teaching instrumental lessons, then modeling on the correct instrument is far more important. So for instance, if your student is meant to be learning how to play trombone and develop sound and technique on trombone, then you, the teacher, need to be modeling good tone and technique on the trombone. It's not ideal to teach an instrument that you don't play yourself, but I totally understand that there'll be situations where really that's the only option. Nonetheless, modeling remains a critical technique for teaching, and you should be using it. Number 2, the next critical teaching technique is called scaffolding. If your students need it, then you should use the teaching technique of scaffolding. And at the beginner or intermediate level, they almost certainly will need that. Scaffolding means helping students to do what they can't quite manage to do on their own. It involves giving them support that they need while they do the thing, and then gradually over time, bit by bit, removing the scaffolding, the support, so that they stand on their own eventually. Now, an example of that might be someone teaching a young child to read. You read along with them and help them to sound out the words at first, but then gradually do that less and less. In my Scales to Chord Changes video, there was a sequence of exercises to develop fluency in a technique of applied harmonic shifts. If you were teaching those exercises, scaffolding might include counting bars out loud for the students, prompting them when to shift emphasis from even notes to odd notes, and if you don't know what I mean by that, check out the video, calling out reminders or corrections, and things like that. Just leaving everything up to the student without support will fail as a teaching technique. Instead, use scaffolding to help them get to a point where they can be independent. Number 3, the next critical teaching technique is semantic waves. Now that's quite a complicated sounding name for something that's actually relatively simple, but at the same time is an incredibly powerful technique for teaching and building knowledge cumulatively over time. You can make links between the immediate exercise and other contexts by using this simple method called semantic waves. This just means facilitating knowledge building over time by moving your teaching between specific examples, such as exercise in the lesson, and abstract, more removed or general contexts. Students need links to be made explicit between what they're doing in the lesson, in the relatively familiar and concrete, immediate situation of their lesson, and the relatively more abstract, distant, far removed context of a famous musician in a recording. Students also build knowledge more efficiently if your teaching moves them between more complex ideas and less complex knowledge. So, simplicity and complexity. You need your students to be able to take the specific things that they're learning in a lesson and apply them in other situations. So, for example, don't just learn this tune and then this tune and then this tune. You don't want your teaching just to be a series of unrelated, to the students in their mind, unrelated encounters with different tunes that have nothing to do with each other. What they need to see is that there are patterns between things. So when they learn one blues tune, they're working in a way on all blues tunes. When they work on a tune that's in a minor key or a 2-5-1 chord progression, they're working on a 2-5-1 or a 1-6-2-5 that's in every song. So then you can take them later and say, remember this 1-6-2-5 in this song? Well, here it is in another song. It's in a different key, but it's the same chord progression. And here it is again in another tune. Remember when we were playing work song in the lesson or in our rehearsal, and you were using a minor pentatonic scale for improvising? Well, here's another tune in a similar hard bop or a soul jazz style. And here's a recording of Kenny Burrell using minor pentatonic scale in this context. He's doing the same thing, it's in a different key, but it's another example of the same thing. You can do this too. So don't just stick to individual cases, but generalize. That's really important. If you watch my Scales to Chord Changes video with its 6 exercises to move from scales to chord changes, you'll see examples of varying contexts and varying complexity. I give general examples of musicians using the technique in recorded examples, as well as me modeling it on a simpler level. I move right down to very specific, immediate exercises like play this note here, right now. Then I make it less specific, but also more complex by expanding to 3 notes, then 5, and then more notes. I shift between concrete exercises like play these exact notes with this rhythm to asking the student to improvise. In the video, I also use colors, sounds, and repetitions to build the idea of even and odd notes and to relate those concepts to chords. And I generalize the concept by expanding to multiple keys. In lessons, I'd continue that process by repeating with exercises and examples from different songs, as well as more recorded examples from famous recordings. Semantic waves are such a powerful and vital teaching tool, and they're one backed up by an ever-growing body of research, that it will get a whole video to itself. Subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss that. Number 4, and the next thing that you need to be an effective teacher, is a realistic learning cycle. When I say realistic teaching and learning cycle, I really just mean to keep in mind that when people learn things, they don't master them immediately. It's unreasonable to expect perfection in each step before you move on to the next step. Learners seem to approximate skills first. First they approximate skills. Then, over time, they consolidate the skills before ultimately moving on to gain fluency. Fluency is probably a better word for it than mastery. Do we ever truly achieve mastery of anything? Maybe we do, but I prefer to call it fluency, so let's stick with that. If you can, you should probably repeat exercises over multiple lessons or multiple rehearsals. So here's an example of teaching with a realistic teaching and learning cycle. If you're rehearsing a tune, like in a big band rehearsal, I advise against simply working on things in a strictly linear fashion. Come to it with a plan. Your band might sight read the whole chart first for a big picture. Maybe stop and start as needed if they train wreck, but just get through it. Don't keep stopping to perfect every little detail as it comes up. Details are for later. After the read-through, you might choose some sections or specific problems to work on. Over several rehearsals, work on improving specific parts or aspects of the performance. But follow your plan. A specific section might be the coda or a saxophone solo. An aspect of the performance might be a common recurring rhythm or interaction between the rhythm section and soloists in a solo section. Or it might be horn intonation in dissonant chord voicings. Early on in the rehearsal cycle, approximate, big picture. Then consolidate and fine-tune and ultimately maybe perfect. That's an example of a realistic teaching and learning cycle, and it will help you teach better and your students to progress faster. Remember that good teaching is a lot more than just being able to play well yourself. If you want to level up your teaching even more and really help your students to achieve their best, then check out this powerful teaching advice next. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more content like this. Bye now and happy teaching.